Welcome to the Beau Show. Cancel culture is the phenomenon of outrage that leads to damaging a person's reputation and livelihood based on current or past behavior that the current society or marginalized people feel are beyond inappropriate. What this usually means is that a person of some stature or notoriety is ceremoniously brought down in flames to the schadenfreude of the many, a fancy German word for delighting in that person's misfortune. There is a substantial degree of shame for the recipient and a certain chilling effect as well. The term call-out culture seems to have been around since 2014, partly due to the Me Too movement. And in 2014, activist Sui Park called out Stephen Colbert of the Colbert Report for what was deemed a racist tweet about Asians, in spite of the Colbert Report's satirical nature. The hashtag #CancelColbert emerged. This phenomenon is thus one in which a certain person or group manages to wage an online campaign of shame against a singular target for perhaps one singular statement or act that leads to the shaming and thus cancellation of that individual. This created a mob mentality because it showed that it was effective. The entity that starts the cancellation does so out of being offended. And I want that word to be clear because much of cancel culture stems from an offense. Sometimes it is indeed criminal, but sometimes it's just offensive to the party creating the storm, meaning their feelings were hurt. And in order to get retribution to a deemed satisfaction, it is necessary to remove any stature or perhaps even income generation for the offending entity. According to the book The Coddling of the American Mind in 2018 by social psychologist Jonathan Haidt and free speech activist Greg Lukianoff, call-out culture arises from what they call safetyism on college campuses. We can put some of the blame of cancel culture on the shoulders of college campuses with the wave of safe spaces, these areas of bubble wrap where you can go so that no one will hurt your feelings or offend you. However, in my view, college campuses should be places where you need to go to find your way and get jostled around, at least academically speaking. But there arose this idea that college should be this sacred place of no offense, which emboldened kids to call out anything they felt was unacceptable. And according to University of Michigan media studies professor Lisa Nakamura, cancel culture is a sort of cultural boycott and born from a desire to control by those who feel they have limited power. So in many ways, this is all about a struggle for power. In more recent years, the term has been used by conservatives to refer to overreactions to politically incorrect speech. It is certain that cancel culture now has a certain political flair to it. Sometimes, to the people who claim cancel culture doesn't exist, are the biggest perpetrators of it. And sometimes those who use the term too often are also equally guilty of doing it themselves. I want to approach this subject as academically as I can because it's just too easy to yell, cancel culture, like they do on some networks. If you create that sort of outrage porn, it undermines the very thing you're working against. We don't need that low-hanging fruit. What I want to do is give you some ideas behind where this phenomenon came from and apply that with logic and realism to today's instances. There are elements of free speech and other sociological phenomena that are at stake. So it's a bit of a complex subject. We know that comedian Kevin Hart stepped down as host of the Oscars in 2019. This dates back to jokes that he had made in 2009 about the possibility of his son being gay and how he would react. By 2015, when Rolling Stone interviewed him, he said PC culture has become so sensitive, he probably wouldn't tell those jokes now. By 2019, when he was announced as Oscars host, the full force of cancel culture Twitter birds was unleashed like the Kraken. He doubled down on his stance, but then he stepped down because he didn't want to be a distraction. The Oscars, which had already become unwatchable by that point, lost a great host because of this. But it stands as one of the great cancels of all time. Now let's frame all of this in terms of two recent Icarus-like falls from grace, even though they are quite different. The first is CNN President Jeff Zucker. He stepped down from the network after revealing that he had failed to disclose a relationship he has with another CNN exec, Alison Gollust. Zucker has an interesting past and career, as he oversaw the Today Show and its rise in ratings, to overseeing the creation of The Apprentice at NBC, which was a launchpad really for Donald Trump's path to the presidency. Zucker was perfectly happy to do business with Trump then, as he saw the show become a ratings juggernaut for NBC. At CNN, he also saw big ratings when Trump became president. But that may be more attributable to both Trump's larger-than-life persona, as well as liberals' desires to foam at the mouth to hate on him. CNN clearly fed that hunger. Ever since, though, CNN's ratings have tumbled 74% from January 2021 to January 2022. While at first you may think, why did he have to resign simply for not disclosing a private relationship? Sure, it's against company rules, but that's not exactly a scandal. The story gets much juicier. For instance, Zucker was Gollust's boss at NBC back in 1996 when Gollust was just a trainee. According to new reports, working together, Zucker and Gollust fed talking points to Gollust's old boss, Governor Andrew Cuomo, in the early months of the pandemic to combat what Trump was saying. The two were also reportedly instrumental in the Andrew Cuomo-Chris Cuomo brotherly love interviews, wherein Gollust kept insisting that Governor Cuomo appear on CNN in spite of his office resisting it. But as you may recall, Zucker fired Chris Cuomo from the network in December, saying that Chris had not been honest with executives in the nature of how he was helping his brother. Naturally, Chris was ticked about this because he claims that Zucker knew full well about this. And if you think about it, if these reports are indeed true about Zucker and Gollust juicing CNN by encouraging the brotherly love interviews, the reasons for Zucker firing Chris have to be deeper than this. Warner Media is the parent company of CNN, and apparently several anchors have written Warner Media to express major frustration for the ousting of Zucker. But Warner Media, who has an imminent merger with Discovery, stands firm in its decision. And some think it's part of a larger effort to rebrand CNN to be more hard news focused, less personality focused, and also less tolerant of improper behavior led by its new owner, John Malone. Perhaps this is reminiscent of what happened with Roger Ailes at Fox News as they tried to rebrand it in the Me Too era. Perhaps higher-ups just weren't happy with CNN's sliding ratings, with Trump gone and them trying to cling to January 6th as their only hope amidst a boring, blundering Biden first year. Malone remarked, quote, "I would like to see CNN evolve back to the kind of journalism that it started with and actually have journalists, which would be unique and refreshing. I do believe good journalism could have a role in this future portfolio that Discovery Time Warner's going to represent," unquote. If this is indeed true, then getting Zucker out of the way would perhaps shift that network. And hey, it's a noble effort to try to steer CNN back to journalistic integrity. After all, I gave you a whole show on Project Veritas and how they have exposed CNN big time. It does seem odd that the revelation of an in-office relationship would be his ouster, though, because that, of course, cannot even remotely compare to Roger Ailes' major transgressions at Fox and the culture that he created. So maybe there's more to it than that. But this has many, many layers, from the Chris Cuomo ouster to the undisclosed relationship, which it seems everyone knew, to a new merger and perhaps a new editorial direction. The way that I tie this back into cancel culture is, was this really a cancel? Well, it doesn't seem that people were outraged about Zucker's in-house tryst or called for his resignation. No one was particularly offended, that I can tell, other than Chris Cuomo. So the real story here may be that Chris, who may sue for denied compensation, has damaging information on Zucker, and perhaps Gollust too, that he threatened to release. And that's why Warner Media made this move. In that way, it would be a cancelable moment. What's also weird is that 4 Democrat members of the January 6th committee said that they feel, quote, devastated for our democracy, unquote, due to this ouster. Now that's odd. Why do they care what happens at a network? Is it because they want wall-to-wall coverage of January 6th so that they can win the midterms? But why did they fire Zucker and not Gollust? She was a comms director for Andrew Cuomo before she joined CNN. She's implicated too. Seems like you have to get rid of them both, no? It's clear that Zucker made CNN an attack dog during the Trump presidency. Jake Tapper and Jim Acosta admit as much and reveled in it. So in this particular case, which is nuanced, it seems that a company decided to remove a top exec at CNN, perhaps not just for an undisclosed affair, but for other editorial transgressions, and perhaps more damaging information that could have hurt the network as it plans to merge and move more into the streaming world. Was there a whistleblower? Who knows? Maybe it's a vengeful Cuomo. But Zucker's ouster was not a mob rule cancel culture moment, per se. But it does show that even a leftist attack dog high on his horse is not immune to the ebbs and flows of the marketplace. He got removed, albeit not at the behest of a mob, but in the end, he's gone. Let's shift to another situation over at the ABC network and Whoopi Goldberg, who has been suspended for 2 weeks for comments she made on The View about the Holocaust. Here's what she said.
It's not about race. It's not about race.
What is it about?
Because it's about man's inhumanity to man.
She doubled down on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert as well.
And the American experience tends to be based on skin.
Yes. And so that is what race means to me. When you talk about being a racist, I was saying you can't call this racism. This was evil. This wasn't based on the skin. You couldn't tell who was Jewish. They had to delve deeply to figure it out.
This is almost incredulous because we all know that Hitler put Jewish people in concentration camps and killed them because of their race. They were considered impure and inferior. Hitler wanted to create one master superior race. That is a textbook definition of racism. But what Whoopi seemed to be implying is that racism is only racism if it is melanin or appearance based, which means it can only be directed at her race or of African lineage. Even Colbert's setup question, the American experience tends to be based on skin. He's starting from an inaccurate and postmodern view of America, that it was inherently racist. That the only reason that America was formed or flourished was entirely based on a superior skin color, and that's just not true. Yes, slavery was a reality, indeed a huge economic one for the South. And the founders decided not to fight that fight when they declared independence, which is why, of course, the Civil War eventually fomented. But in today's woke culture, racism is viewed through the prism of being one-directional. You can offend a straight white male like myself, that's fair game, but you cannot offend anyone else. But for Joy Behar, who is Jewish, to sit there and act so nonchalant when Whoopi said the Holocaust was not about race, but yet she has walked out when conservative guests have been on The View. That's disgraceful. After doubling down, Whoopi did an about-face and she apologized. But the network still put her in timeout for 2 weeks so that she could reflect about her hurtful statements in the past. Now, I have devoted a whole show to The View before and how they marginalize the conservative viewpoint. They have since done away with any conservative panelist whatsoever, thereby canceling it. So The View has become exactly what the title implies, The View. Not many views, not a view, but The View. Any conservative who has been on that show validates this and has expressed extreme discomfort and displeasure at how they were treated. There was no outrage when this happened. People didn't explode on Twitter and demand that the show bring back Elizabeth Hasselbeck or make the panel more fair and equal, because that's not what the show wants. They have imposed their largely uniform viewpoint. However, isn't it interesting that when the moderator, Whoopi Goldberg, goes out on a limb to explain why she sees the Holocaust differently, as out of touch and egregious as that comes across, she's told to take time off for 2 weeks. She didn't violate any FCC rules or become violent towards a staffer, but she did say something that offended a lot of people, and understandably so. But if the show is called The View. Either it needs to embrace the diversity of its views or not. They have never suspended anyone like this before for offensive comments that I can find. I can only compare this to a similar show that I was on, where I was the only opposing perspective to this liberally minded uniformity of the rest of the panel. And you have to have a lot of courage to be able to say what you want to say, knowing you're going to be attacked. Of course, I never said anything remotely as outlandish as Whoopi, and I certainly know the atrocities of Hitler's race-based Holocaust. As absurd as what Whoopi said is, can we not allow the free market and free-thinking people to make up their minds about what she said and subsequently decide whether to watch The View again or not? I just elect not to watch it, because you actually become dumber if you do. There is zero honest intellectual conversation happening there. But remember, it matters whom you offend. And many Jewish people are in very, very high positions at networks. And I'm certain that they were totally offended. However, Whoopi is black, and that creates another wrinkle in this. Had this been Sarah Haynes that said this, or especially Meghan McCain, I think ABC would have fired them on the spot. Whoopi is black, and because she is a minority, offending another minority, it puts them in a pickle. Number one, because they are called The View, and they hired Whoopi Goldberg to provide her view. Secondly, because Whoopi is a golden goose, an accomplished person, and thirdly, because she is a minority. And they have to not punish her too badly, or else they could be seen as racist for firing her. Do you see what I mean? So a 2-week suspension is the happy medium. It's the compromise. It's like, okay, time out for you. But if you were white, we'd burn you at the stake. So you get a slight demerit. Here's how Bill Maher framed it.
Can I just say this? I had on last week Ira Glasser, former longtime head of the ACLU, talking about free speech. Whoopi Goldberg, who, by the way, I hope is still a friend, we can disagree with each other, should not be canceled or put off her show, as much as I totally disagree with her crazy statement. Free speech. She should be there. She shouldn't get a timeout.
Not every single thing has to be for everybody.
Right.
We can have platforms that have stuff on them that not everyone on that platform or who consumes stuff on that platform enjoys. And The View is a particularly weird place to do a cancellation.
It's called The View?
It's called The View. It's not called The Facts.
Yeah, but isn't it interesting that it's called, I mean, I don't think they meant this when Barbara Walters invented it a long time ago, but it's The View.
Well,
that's the problem in America.
But
there is one view,
right, and
one
that's clearly
true opinion, and everybody else can go sit in the corner.
So I'm seeing this from both angles. One is that, okay, this is free speech. She is saying how she feels, as disturbing as that is to so many people. But on the other hand, did she get special treatment? Bill Maher thinks her suspension is insulting, and in many ways it is. Of course, not to Jewish people who needed some action, but did he consider that had this been a white person or a conservative person, they'd be burned at the stake? I think on free speech issues like this, we cannot just oversimplify it, because what is considered fair today may be considered egregious a year later. We have seen this. And now people are even using the word misinformation to punish free speech. We saw it with Joe Rogan, a white guy that they certainly want to cancel. The Whoopi suspension may be a product of both the mob coming after her and also the corporate wokeism that has created corporate activism. Think Coca-Cola and other companies with respect to the Georgia election laws. Think AOC and Lin-Manuel Miranda and the attempted boycott of Goya Foods that backfired. The bigger point really is that sometimes the left eats its own. It starts out as the oppressed attempting to wrest back power by taking down a successful person. And in some cases, it's not a bad thing. Harvey Weinstein is a great case for that. Sometimes you do need the power of numbers to demand change. But really, Harvey had his day in court. He was judged by his peers. There were too many victims. The real scandal there is how many people turned a blind eye to it. Same with Jeffrey Epstein. Did ABC cover up the Amy Robach story because it implicated too many Democrats with Epstein? I mean, Harvey was a huge Democrat supporter too. But the irony, of course, is that for a major show to be called The View, they only really want one desired view. What this should not be is a race for who is the most oppressed. We can't create a healthy society by canceling someone every time they offend someone else. The left created safe spaces, but they let their own people attack the safe space. They may not want to hear the words of Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson, but they end up getting offended by Whoopi Goldberg and Bill Maher. Societies don't advance by attacking and defaming and canceling. Everyone makes mistakes. But now we have a cultural strata of offense and offenders. There is a hierarchy for it. Do you recall that Nick Cannon made some atrocious comments about Jewish people too, and he praised Louis Farrakhan? Viacom CBS fired him. But after Cannon apologized, they restored his contract. He said that this should be about counsel culture, not cancel culture. While I don't disagree with that sentiment, that's just not the reality of how things are. We are in a bloodthirsty world. It's very polarized. Some of the irony of this Whoopi story is that Whoopi's birth name is Karen Elaine Johnson. She says that Goldberg is a name in her family and that is Jewish in origin. In fact, one account claims that her mother thought that her last name was not Jewish enough to be successful in Hollywood, so Goldberg would be much more, well, Jewish. DNA tests that were revealed in the PBS documentary African American Lives found her to be 92% sub-Saharan African. And researcher Henry Louis Gates Jr. found that there was no discernible Jewish or German ancestry and no known Goldberg in her roots. So this is another irony. A comedian who is trying to make it in Hollywood changes her last name to be more appealing to the very community that she thinks was not targeted for race in the Holocaust. Yet she used race to gain favor with a group that is very influential in Hollywood. That's like me changing my last name to like Disney or Rockefeller. Are people really going to do their research if they ask? So for Whoopi to say, I don't think that Hitler was really racist, just inhuman, is to be extremely racially naive when she has benefited from the very race she's offending, a name she adopted for career gain. Can we blame her for changing her stage name? Not really, but she's also been disingenuous about it. Should we hold her to account for this fib and for being naive about the Holocaust at a time when we still have Holocaust deniers? Certainly. But should she lose her job or even be suspended for being this naive? Well, there are two thoughts on this. One is that if we uphold free speech, she should be able to say whatever she wants to. Offensive speech is protected. The second is that within companies, you do not have unfettered free speech. Companies care about their reputations. And even though boycotts aren't really effective, they don't want to be thought of as racially insensitive, especially now. You hear this argument of being on the right side of history. That's really not about being evolved as much as it is following in line with the prevailing attitudes. I think speech should be free because that's what the founding fathers wanted. But it should also be measured. A careful tongue is the way to go. Whoopi has done many remarkable things in her career and came from nothing. But when you're on a show like The View, you do bear some responsibility. But the audience and the execs also bear responsibility for how they react. The knee-jerk reaction should not be, oh my God, get this woman off TV and kill her career. It should be more like, wow, that seems pretty out there. You know, is Whoopi thinking clearly, or do we come from two very, very different worlds and perspectives? Because people really do. And we also have to stop ranking races and racial comments. To find truth, you must be willing to be offended. Harvard has discriminated against Asian students in favor of preferred minorities. But you'll hear a lot less about that than Whoopi's faux pas. What you've ever said or done can now be captured for eternity and used against you without you ever being given a chance to respond or clarify. If you're Jeff Zucker, maybe your undisclosed relationship was just the tip of the iceberg. And if you're Whoopi, you like your job, but now the left has even bit back at you too. This is what I mean when I say the left can eat its own. The very people who don't want conservatives to have a platform end up deplatforming their own people. Zucker booted Cuomo, and then Cuomo's big mouth likely led to Warner Media booting Zucker. I think we all should take a step back and protect the freedom of speech vigilantly, but also protect the integrity of speech and our responsibilities, not just in what we say, but in how we react when we hear speech that doesn't gel with how we speak. Getting offended is not a crime. How we have selectively decided whom to muzzle, when, and how often is a very peculiar thing, and that is to be carefully considered as we move forward in a speech-conscious society. I'm Beau, and for today, that's the show.